Hey there, Matt Easton, Scholar Gladiatoria. So, I sell antique swords, as everybody here knows, and I've got lots of antique swords in the collection, and I've got replica swords as well. And obviously I teach HEMA, and I do fencing, and I do test cutting, and that's kind of what this video is about. But it's also about antique swords. I get asked a lot, can you use antique swords for test cutting? Well, in short, yes you can, but it's a contentious topic because obviously many antique swords are essentially archaeological artifacts. They're historical artifacts of great importance, and if we used antiques and destroyed them, there wouldn't be any left, and that would be awful. That being said, there are many antiques in the world which are perishing, which are sitting in sheds and attics and rusting away to nothing. And equally, there are many antiques which are of a kind which is fairly numerous and doesn't have any intrinsic particular historical value other than being an example of that thing. So what I've got here is a sword, and first of all I will also say that I do have a couple of antiques that I test cut with. They're very particularly chosen, and the reason how I set up on those two things are fit into two kinds of criteria. So one example of something I've cut with, and you can find videos of me cutting with it under the test cutting playlist on my channel, which you can find here, is a cutlass, a Naval Cutlass. Now that Naval Cutlass, when I got it, was in not terrible condition. It was a bit rusty. It had been service sharpened, the hilt was loose, and so as an antique, yes, it had some value. I got it for the type of cutlass it is, relatively cheap, and essentially I restored it. That is, I repeened the end of the tang, so I tightened up the hilt construction because it had got loose, don't know why, don't know how. I cleaned the rust off it, and in doing so I discovered that it had been service sharpened and had still quite a good edge on it. So in cleaning it, I also made it sharp, and in making it sharp I didn't damage it, I didn't destroy it, I didn't change its inherent kind of nature at all. I essentially restored it in the truest sense of the word. I restored it to what it would have been shortly before it moved into whatever kind of neglected kind of condition and neglected kind of existence that it passed into and was then ignored for 100 years. So I took it back to where it was, but one important thing is that it had been service sharpened, and this is, I think, probably the most contentious aspect of using an antique sword for test cutting. Some swords have been service sharpened because they saw active service, or because they were sharpened for some other reason, maybe for test cutting in the Victorian period, which they themselves did. And so many swords, in fact probably the majority of antique swords, certainly in Britain, have not been service sharpened, and therefore they're blunt, because when they're made in the workshop, I suppose we could call it a factory, but when they're made in a factory or workshop at the time, they were made with a not quite sharp edge. That's not to say that it's like a reenactment edge, don't imagine like a reenactment sword, but they were made with an edge that's about 1 millimeter thick, so it's maybe half a millimeter thick, so it's too thick to cut water bottles or tatami mats or meat or whatever else you want to test cut, too blunt to cut. And I kind of feel like if a sword's never been service sharpened, that tells you something about that sword's life. It tells you that it was almost certainly never taken on active service. Whereas a sword that has been service sharpened, you get into another minefield, because number one, it has been sharpened, so you could just restore that edge and you're not intrinsically changing its history. But on the other hand, you could say that's probably got more historical value from one point of view because it's been on service, it's been on campaign, and for all you know, that sword could have killed someone, or it could have defended someone's life, or it could have been with someone when they died. And I actually have at least a couple of swords that in fact I do have two swords definitely, and possibly more, but I have two swords that I know were being carried by people when they were killed, which is quite poignant and quite, we shouldn't overlook that. Those are historical artifacts, and I would not test cut with those because I kind of feel like I know their history. I can pass on their history, and those should be kept as artifacts as they are. However, there are some swords, as mentioned, that don't fit into that category. And this is an example of that type of sword. So what is it? Well, first of all, it's a rifles officer's sword, 1827 pattern on paper, hilt, but with a blade of the fullered type that came in 1845, of the so-called Wilkinson type. It is not a Wilkinson made blade, but it's a Wilkinson style blade. They came in 1845. So what this is a rifles officer's sword, which dates to after 1845 and before 1892, when the blade style changed. So it's from the second half, well, middle to second half of the 19th century. It's probably made for rifle volunteers, although I don't know that. So you can sometimes tell whether a rifles officer's sword is made for volunteer rifles or regular army. To explain the difference, volunteer rifles means like what we would have as territorial army or reserves. In America, be like something like the National Guard, something like that. So essentially it's not regular army, it's not people whose main job is to be in the army, but they serve as reservists, essentially. So some of these rifles, in fact the majority of these rifles swords from the Victorian period, are made for reserves officers. This one has been service sharpened, which means it's possibly, not definitely, but possibly not a reservist sword. It's possibly made for someone in the regular army in one of the rifles. So for example, the 60th Rifles were a famous rifle regiment. So it could be for regular army, it could be for reservists, we don't know, but it's been service sharpened. Now, that being said, it's in pretty bad condition, although it's in bad condition from a collector's point of view, and let me qualify that. It's rusty, it's got no visible markings, I can't see the maker's name, it's obscured by rust and pitting. The whole of the blade, which would have been etched probably, is covered in kind of crusty type of rust and pitting. I can see there's pitting under there, and I can't see any remnants of any markings whatsoever. The hilt is rusty, the back strap is rusty, the pommel is rusty, and the shagreen, in other words the shark skin of the grip, has a section missing. So I would say the shagreen is about 90% present. All of the grip wire is there, which is nice. So all of the wires are still intact and tight. But this sword marks itself as different from the most of the bad condition antique swords you find, in that it is utterly structurally sound. Okay, so you can see it's got all of the flex in the blade. I won't push it into my hand, it's because it's sharp. But it's got all of the flex in the blade and it returns to true. Okay, so the steel is fundamentally in good condition, the heat treatment's intact. It's been service sharpened and it's got a few little nicks in the edge, probably from someone messing around. But nevertheless, it's been service sharpened. The hilt, the guard is utterly solid, there's no movement there whatsoever. The peen nut at the end, in fact it is a nut on a thread, or will be, I know because I've seen these deconstructed and I've restored some. That is a nut that's rounded and then peened as well at the end. That's intact and solid. The back strap is all solid, there's no movement in the back strap, and the shagreen is in, you know, what's still there is in reasonable condition. It's not floating off the wood, it's still attached to the wood, and the grip wire isn't floating around, that's also tight. So what we've got here is what I would consider a perfect candidate to turn into a sword for test cutting. Now, in terms of test cutting, some people may go, oh, it's still a historical artifact, you're still gonna potentially, you know, damage it or harm this historical artifact, even if it's not in good condition, by using it for cutting things. Well, no, I'm not. Firstly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean it up and I'm going to restore the edge to cutting sharp. In doing that, I will improve the aesthetics of the sword. It will mean that it will go from a rusty old sword that frankly has been living in someone's shed or attic or somewhere like that, storage room, for decades and decades, possibly hundred of years. This probably dates to the 1860s, this sword, maybe 1870s. So it could be neglected, could be forgotten, could be literally thrown away into a skip or into one of those idiotic police knife and sword collection bins that serve no purpose at all, given that every kitchen has got kitchen knives in it, and melted down and destroyed for recycling, or it could have gone anywhere in a neglected state, but I'm going to restore it to a nicer aesthetic state where it will be valued more, and additionally I'm going to give it a purpose again. I'm going to give it an edge and I'm going to use it for cutting, and I will show you at the end of that process. I don't know how long I will take, I don't know how often I'll be able to work on this, but I will show you the process of taking this from a rusty old sword to a sword that I can actually do test cutting with. And the other thing to add, is test cutting is and should be, at least if you're adequate at test cutting, should be non-destructive. Because if you're cutting things like water bottles or tatami mats, it's not going to damage the sword at all. It's not going to damage any part of the hilt. It's not going to damage the blade. It's not going to bend or break or notch or scratch it even. I will clean this blade up, give it an edge, use it for test cutting, and the sword will live happily with that, not be destroyed. It will be in a better state, and it will be valued and looked after, and probably sold on from me or passed on from me, and be used by someone else for years to come, where it may not have been if it was left in a rusty state. So there we go. If you're looking for an antique sword to turn into a cutter, look for something that is structurally sound. So as a weapon, as a fighting weapon, this old rusty antique sword is absolutely as good as the day it was made. It's got its blade temper and spring just as good as normal. It's been service sharpened already, so I'm not changing that. And the guard is all strong and intact and solid. It's not going to suffer from being waved around and chopping up water bottles in the garden. So look for something like that, where it doesn't have any intrinsic particular historical value. And in fact, by restoring it or cleaning it or polishing it, you're actually increasing its historical interest and the way that it's valued by people today. So that's the type of sword you're looking for. Now we're going to look at how I'm going to go about that process of transforming this sword into essentially a backyard cutter. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.